There's a phrase you probably heard at work this week. It sounded like a compliment. You may have even thanked the person who said it. Maybe it was sincere, but it also could have been a carefully crafted trap. And in many cases, the person who said it knows exactly the effect it has. Corporate manipulators don't yell, don't make threats, and don't leave obvious traces. They work through phrases that sound professional, seem harmless, and could even be quoted in a leadership handbook. And that's exactly why they work. Because by the time you realize what that phrase may have been hiding, you've already signed off, agreed, or given up ground that's very difficult to get back. Over the next few minutes, you're going to discover 7 phrases that show up again and again in corporate environments, what they may be hiding beneath the surface, and one possible response for each. Pay special attention to number 6. It's probably the one you heard today, and you may not have realized it even had a name. Before we continue, if you feel like you need a better understanding of the invisible rules of the corporate world, you're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave a like. It's the first step toward stopping work in the dark and starting to see the game more clearly. One clarification before we begin. A single phrase, by itself, does not prove manipulation. What matters is the pattern surrounding it. A great leader can use the exact same words as a manipulator. The difference isn't in the vocabulary, it's in whether those words come with real support or nothing but expectations. Each of these 7 phrases will be broken down into 3 layers. First, what it appears to mean. Second, what it may actually mean. And third, one possible way to respond. The first phrase is, "I trust you to handle this." It sounds like recognition, like someone finally values your judgment and experience. But in many corporate environments, this phrase doesn't transfer authority or resources. Above all, it transfers responsibility. The pattern repeats itself over and over. A complicated project lands on your desk with no clear budget, no realistic deadline, and it arrives wrapped in a compliment that makes it much harder to say no. After hearing, "I trust you to handle this," saying no can feel like betraying someone's confidence. That's the exact moment when it's worth paying close attention. Accepting the compliment, while, at the very same moment, negotiating the resources and success criteria in writing, is usually far more effective than rejecting it outright. Not after the conversation, but during it, while the words are still hanging in the air. The second phrase is, "It's not personal, it's just business." This is often the rhetorical license people use to justify an attack disguised as professionalism. When someone says it, they've often just done something that was, in fact, personal, and now they need you not to react as though it was. The phrase shifts the focus away from what they did and onto your emotional response. Suddenly, the conversation is no longer about the other person's actions. It's about how you're taking them. Bringing the discussion back where it belongs can be as simple as saying, "I understand, so let's talk business. What objective criteria support this decision?" Manipulation rarely survives when it's forced to stand on concrete standards. The third phrase is, "Everyone here goes the extra mile." This phrase normalizes overload by appealing to an imaginary group. No one really knows who everyone is, but somehow it can make any personal boundary feel like a betrayal of the team. It's one of the oldest tools in corporate culture, and it still works because it taps into something deeply human. The fear of being seen as the person who doesn't pull their weight. Asking for specifics usually takes the power out of it, because vague language rarely survives a direct question. What exactly does "going the extra mile" mean in this situation, and for how long is it expected to continue? The phrase loses its force the moment it has to become a number. A hypothetical example makes this easier to see. Imagine someone working in customer service who hears that phrase every month for months on end whenever unpaid overtime becomes necessary to close out the month. They never ask what the extra mile actually means because asking feels inappropriate. Then one day, during a meeting, they ask the exact question we just mentioned. The response is an uncomfortable silence, followed by a vague promise to look into it. In many cases, that silence says more than any explanation ever could. It's the first clear sign that the extra mile was never meant to have a defined limit. The fourth phrase is, "You're too sensitive," or its close cousin, "You're taking this too personally." This can function as a way to invalidate someone's perception instead of addressing the specific event that caused it. There's an important difference between a legitimate comment about someone's behavior and a judgment about their emotions. Manipulators usually understand that difference very well, even if they intentionally use it backward. Separating those two layers out loud, without becoming confrontational, helps steer the conversation back on course. We can talk about my tone afterward. First, let's talk about what actually happened. Said calmly, that sentence brings the conversation back to the facts, which is exactly the territory that was being avoided. The fifth phrase is, "We'll talk about it later." That later that never comes isn't always distraction or lack of time. In certain contexts, it's a strategy. Whoever controls the timing of a difficult conversation often controls its outcome. Every time an uncomfortable issue gets postponed indefinitely, the person who raised it loses momentum, loses clarity, and often ends up dropping the issue simply out of exhaustion. Turning something vague into something concrete, the moment the phrase is spoken, is usually more effective than following up later. Sounds good. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. or 4 p.m.? Then document that agreement in writing, so later stops being a promise floating in the air. The sixth phrase, the one you probably heard today, is, "I need you to be more flexible." It's one of the hardest to recognize because it almost never defines exactly what it's asking for. Flexibility without a definition can function like an emotional blank check. Every reasonable boundary you set afterward runs the risk of being retroactively labeled as proof that you're inflexible. Have you ever felt like no matter how much you gave, it was never enough? That's exactly how this mechanism works. It thrives on uncertainty because uncertainty is what keeps someone available without clear limits. Depending on the situation, your response can be more or less diplomatic, but the goal is always the same. Turn an ambiguous criticism into a concrete standard. Absolutely. Tell me specifically what behavior you'd like me to change, and in what situations. Ambiguity rarely survives when precision is required. The seventh phrase is the only one that arrives as an open threat. "If you won't do it, I'll find someone who will." It's placed at the end of the list for a reason. By the time someone gets to this point, it often means the previous 6 approaches have stopped working. And while it sounds intimidating, in many cases this phrase is actually a sign of urgency disguised as strength. Very few people need to make open threats when they still have genuine control over the situation. When someone reaches this point, they've usually exhausted the subtler tools, and an outright threat is all they have left. That doesn't mean the threat has no real consequences. It simply means the person making it has already lost some of the control they had at the beginning of the conversation. And that changes the balance of power, even if it doesn't seem that way in the moment. Everything depends on something very few people build before they need it, their own room to maneuver outside that specific job. The clearer your alternatives are, the less power that threat has over you. Preparing in advance turns this phrase from a weapon into little more than background noise, and turns the person hearing it into someone who makes decisions instead of someone who merely reacts. Before we wrap up, there's one idea worth holding on to above all the others. Manipulative people don't control your decisions. They control the meaning of words. The day you take that meaning back, they stop controlling the conversation. That doesn't mean becoming suspicious of everyone or assuming every kind phrase is a trap. It simply means paying attention to patterns instead of isolated words. The difference between a genuine statement and a manipulative one is almost never what's said. It's what follows afterward. Let's go through the 7 phrases one more time, in quick succession. "I trust you to handle this." It's not personal, it's just business. "Everyone here goes the extra mile." "You're too sensitive." "We'll talk about it later." "I need you to be more flexible." And, "If you won't do it, I'll find someone who will." Starting today, each of these phrases can work in your favor. Instead of disarming you, they alert you. Instead of convincing you, they confirm that you're looking at a pattern worth examining more carefully. Which of these phrases did you hear today? If this video helped you put a name to something you'd been feeling but couldn't explain, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave a like. Reclaiming the meaning of words is the first step towards stopping yourself from operating in the dark at work. In the next video in this series, we're going to explore another silent pattern of the corporate world, one that almost nobody recognizes until it's already too late.